At 0615 hours on August 21, 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stood at the fringe of a coconut grove on Guadalcanal's Tenaru, Alligator Creek area. Peering across a shallow, moonlit sandbar at the American defensive line, he was about to smash with 917 of Japan's finest soldiers. Men hardened by years of rigorous training, veterans of earlier victories across Asia, and believers in a doctrine that had convinced them for decades that spirit could defeat steel. They carried with them the confidence of a nation taught to see itself as descended from gods, heirs to a sacred bloodline, and practitioners of Yamato Damashii, the invincible will that Japanese military thought held superior to Western material advantages. And yet within 6 hours, roughly 800 of those men would be dead, and what the Japanese High Command thought it knew about American fighting men would begin to shatter. To understand why Ichiki presumed victory, we must travel backward through time and belief. Japanese doctrine in the early 20th century had crystallized around spiritual superiority as the decisive margin in war, a conviction reinforced by the stunning Russian defeat in 1905 and nourished by cultural myths in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki that placed the emperor as a divine figure and Japanese soldiers as heirs to a warrior ethos that could transcend modern weapons. From that intellectual soil grew the conclusion, widely taught in officer schools and whispered in staff rooms, that Western soldiers, and particularly Americans, were soft, individualistic, and spiritually compromised by material comfort. Where Japan stressed sacrifice and collective destiny, Western armies were thought to value life over honor, to break when the crisis was greatest. The early months of the Pacific War seemed to validate this belief. The Philippines fell in a matter of weeks. Thousands of Allied prisoners were taken after chaotic surrenders. Singapore collapsed in what Churchill called a calamity, and other far-flung garrisons crumbled before the aggressive, often seemingly suicidal Japanese assault doctrine. Even the stiff resistance on Wake Island was quickly consigned as an anomaly. The defenders were trapped without escape, and the imperial staff concluded they had been proven right. Superior will trump material disadvantages. The United States Marine Corps, in Japanese eyes, was particularly unimpressive. A small, lightly equipped service with little recent combat experience, mostly occupied with policing actions in the interwar years and never expected to stand up to one of Japan's elite regiments. Their amphibious pedigree was underestimated, and their doctrinal transformation in the 1930s, the development of techniques, small unit leadership, and a fighting culture built for island warfare, was invisible too. The intelligence that mattered in Tokyo. Ichiki himself, animated by those beliefs and eager for glory, was ordered theoretically to wait for the rest of his regiment to assemble before attacking the American-held airfield the Marines had seized the first week of August, an airfield the Americans would rename Henderson Field and around which the fate of the island would hinge. But he saw no need to delay. A single echelon of 900 men, he decided, would be adequate to fling the invaders back into the sea. After all, the intelligence from aerial reconnaissance and reports from Rabaul suggested only token American presence and no significant ships nearby. The reality, unknown to Ichiki and hidden from Imperial headquarters by deliberate optimism and flawed reporting, was that the Marines numbered roughly 11,000 on Guadalcanal and had a perimeter they were preparing to defend. On the American side, Major General Alexander Vandegrift and his men were in no mood to surrender or flee. Vandegrift, a 54-year-old veteran who had cut his teeth in the banana wars in China, had been promised months to train but received 3 frantic weeks before Operation Watchtower launched on August 7, 1942. 11,000 Marines landed by surprise on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Island, took the unfinished airfield, and by the night of August 8 had secured their objective, only to see the larger naval picture collapse when a Japanese force dealt the Allied cruiser screen a stinging defeat at the Battle of Savo Island and forced Admiral Fletcher to withdraw carriers and heavy ships to preserve what remained of the fleet. That withdrawal left the Marines ashore short of supplies, ammunition, and heavy equipment and exposed to sustained counterattack. An abandonment remembered with bitter resentment by veterans who felt the Navy had literally dropped the hot potato into their hands. From those desperate circumstances, limited food, scant artillery, a jungle landscape they had never trained for, disease and mosquitoes that would incapacitate more men than bullets in coming weeks, emerged a defensive resolve sharpened by training, leadership, and improvisation. Engineers and infantry alike dug in, finished the airfield with captured Japanese gear, and improvised a perimeter that would soon be tested. Ichiki's nighttime crossing at approximately 0130 hours on August 21st across the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek unfolded like a tragic replay of assumptions. Japanese soldiers screaming banzai, bayonets fixed, expecting the mental collapse of Americans who, in the Japanese narrative, would break at the sight of fanatical close-order assault. Instead, the Marines were calm, disciplined, and lethal. Machine gun nests along the creek opened with surgical violence, .30 caliber belts chewed through charging waves, pre-registered artillery slammed concentrations, and the water became a killing field as men fell thick and fast. Individual acts of heroism catalogued the night's brutality. Blinded by shrapnel but still firing by touch, a wounded Marine named Al Schmid kept his machine gun grinding until dawn with assistance from his comrade. When dawn came, a counterattack organized by Van de Grift, including infantry crossing upstream and light M3 Stuart tanks called Iron Cavalry, encircled and methodically slaughtered or captured Ichiki's remnants in a coconut grove, with tanks treads and machine guns finishing what the night had begun. By evening the Tenaru attack was over. Ichiki's force was effectively annihilated, roughly 800 of 917 killed, while Marine casualties totaled in the dozens, an exchange rate that would force Japan to confront the uncomfortable possibility that their assumptions were wrong. The immediate Japanese reaction, however, was denial. Staff in Rabaul and the Imperial General Headquarters refused the idea that Marines could annihilate a regiment. The narrative preferred to blame insufficient numbers, poor execution, or bad luck rather than reassess doctrine. That refusal would have deadly consequences, for rather than re-evaluate their estimation of American martial quality, Tokyo ordered more men. Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi, experienced, popular with his troops, and a man of some tactical imagination, was given command of a larger force and a more subtle plan. Where Ichiki had attacked the obvious approach, Kawaguchi planned to march his men through the terrible, uncooperative jungle to strike the Marine perimeter from the south, up a ridge that sat like a knuckle of high ground overlooking Henderson Field. His intention was to bypass the obvious defenses and achieve surprise in a night attack. The ridge, unnamed then but later immortalized as Edsons Ridge or Bloody Ridge, would become the crucible in which the doctrines of both sides would be tested anew. Kawaguchi's difficulties began before the first bullet. Destroyer and barge convoys ran the gauntlet of American air and PT boat attacks to land his men, and the jungle itself proved a better defender than any Marine. Trails vanished into green chaos, units became separated, supplies disappeared or were destroyed, and the synchronization that Kawaguchi hoped for dissolved into exhaustion, disorganization, and loss of combat power. Still he believed the attack would break the Americans. The idea that sheer determination at close quarters would induce the defenders to crumble remained ingrained. What he did not fully reckon with was the Marines' doctrinal evolution. Units like Edsons Raiders and parachute battalions were specialists in close combat, trained to operate under dispersed conditions, and paired with pre-registered artillery and seasoned leadership who practiced initiative and small unit decision-making. When Kawaguchi launched the night assault on September 12, 1942, the ridge became a nightmarish tableau. Flares turned the jungle into a fractured, staccato landscape of shadows and muzzle flashes, Japanese waves assaulted with screaming fanaticism, and Marines entrenched behind pre-planned artillery targets called in devastating fire that broke assault formations before they could coalesce. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt "Red Mike" Edson, a veteran of counter-guerrilla warfare who embodied aggressive leadership and personal courage, moved along his line shouting orders and directing counterattacks, and when the Japanese breached the line at points, close-quarters fighting ensued that tested individual mettle to the utmost. Bayonet and buttstock met bayonet and blade in the sweaty darkness, but the Marines held. By dawn Kawaguchi's men had been repelled, suffering catastrophic casualties. Over 600 dead on the ridge alone, and the survivors melted back into a jungle that would exact its own slow toll of disease and starvation. Richard B. Frank and other historians would later insist that this was the closest the Japanese ever came to breaking the island. Van de Grift himself admitted that had the ridge fallen, the situation would have been grave indeed. Yet the larger strategic lesson should have been obvious. The Tenaru and Bloody Ridge defeats should have uprooted the Japanese belief in their own spiritual monopoly on resolute fighting, but Japan's military culture, one that discouraged candid failure reporting, punished initiative that departed from prescriptive plans, and preferred explanations that preserved the honor of doctrine, instead led to escalation. Send better troops, more of them, more ships, better coordination. So the Imperial Command threw more into the crucible. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake arrived in October with the 2nd Sendai Division battle-hardened veterans, and planned a coordinated multi-directional offensive designed to crush the marine perimeter by weight of numbers, artillery, and naval bombardment. The date for the decisive blow was set. Staff in Tokyo even prepared surrender ceremonies that reflected their smug conviction. On the night of October 23rd to 24th, the coordinated offensive began in earnest, and the southern sector where the Sendai Division would strike saw some of the most desperate fighting of the campaign. Sergeant John Basilone, a machine gunner whose stoic endurance and technical mastery of the .30 caliber were legendary, manned critical positions that night and into the next day, hauling ammunition across fire-swept ground, repairing jammed guns with burned hands, and refusing to yield as his crews were fed into the meat grinder. Bodies piled so thick in front of his emplacements that Marines had to clear corpses to reopen fields of fire. Basilone's actions, later recognized with a Medal of Honor, were mirrored across the perimeter by men like Lewis, Chesty, Puller, and countless others who held their sectors against waves of assault that should by old logic have induced collapse. Yet in every sector pre-registered artillery, coordinated small unit leadership, adaptability, and sheer willingness to endure tipped the scales. The Japanese assaults, vast in scope and committed with ferocious bravery, nonetheless fragmented against an adaptive defense. Interrogations afterward revealed a crucial cultural difference. When asked why Japanese units did not exploit weak spots after seeing frontal attacks fail, prisoners answered, "That is not the Japanese way. The plan must go as written." That rigid, plan-bound approach contrasted with Marine training that encouraged initiative and decentralized decision-making, a decisive intangible in the jungle chaos where terrain and chance constantly demanded improvisation. The October offensive collapsed with appalling Japanese losses, between 2,200 and 3,000 dead, while American casualties were measured in hundreds, a lopsided exchange that signaled not merely the failure of one operation but the erosion of a strategic assumption that had propelled Japanese planning. As the weeks and months wore on, Guadalcanal ceased to be a stepping stone that Japan could easily reclaim and instead became Starvation Island for Japanese troops, a place where supply lines were thin, the Tokyo Express's nightly runs insufficient against American air and naval interdiction, and the diseases of the Solomons, malaria, dysentery, beriberi, gnawed away at the fighting strength more inexorably than any Marine rifle. Supply drums and sacks tossed overboard from fleeing destroyers often floated away, sank, or were lost. The psychological effect of watching American planes take off from a runway the Japanese could not capture and ships resupply the adversary while their own forces starved was incalculable. By December, Hyakutake sent desperate messages to Tokyo acknowledging the reality on the ground. No food, unable to send scouts, and the implausible request to die an honorable death rather than perish slowly of hunger. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto compared Guadalcanal to Port Arthur, an extraordinary historical evocation that conveyed the scale of the disaster as he saw it. The island would eventually yield to the Americans when Japan conducted Operation Coup, a carefully executed evacuation in early February 1943 that removed roughly 10,600 surviving troops while leaving behind more than 14,000 dead from combat and an additional 9,000 who died of disease and starvation, a staggering cost that underscored the campaign's human toll. For every American killed, nearly 10 Japanese soldiers perished. But perhaps the most consequential casualty of Guadalcanal was not a unit or a ship but an idea. The myth of Japanese invincibility, the belief that spiritual superiority alone could overwhelm material and logistical imbalances. The Marines who endured Henderson Field did not set out to disprove doctrine. They acted on training, leadership, cohesion, and the simple, raw determination to hold the ground allotted to them. Their success was built of rehearsal and improvisation, of artillery observers adjusting fire under moonlight, of junior leaders making decisions when communication failed, and of men who refused to run because the man beside them depended on their steadiness. The Japanese High Command, schooled in cultural assumptions that elevated obedience and planned fidelity over initiative, found itself unable to adapt quickly enough in the face of an enemy who fought with equal ferocity, and in many crucial respects superior logistical support. Guadalcanal did more than hold an airfield. It throttled the operational momentum Japan believed it had and inaugurated the grinding, attritional island-hopping campaign that would drain Japanese resources and invert the strategic balance across the Pacific. Van de Grift earned the Medal of Honor for his leadership. Merritt Edson was likewise recognized, and his ridge would bear his name, and John Basilone's fame, and later tragic return to combat and death on Iwo Jima, became emblematic of the courage that had defined the campaign. The 1st Marine Division wore Guadalcanal on its shoulder patch and carried the sobriquet, the Old Breed, as an honorific forged in the mud and blood of that island. For Japanese commanders like Kawaguchi, the campaign's cost was a bitter lesson in the limits of doctrine and the consequences of underestimating an adaptive enemy. His post-war judgment that Guadalcanal was the graveyard of the Japanese army was a grimly accurate summation of what the island had consumed. Some of the empire's finest units, veteran aircrew and ships that could not be replaced easily, and perhaps above all the illusion of spiritual invulnerability. In the decades since, the battlefields have returned to jungle, the ruts filled with soil, rusted equipment half swallowed by vines, and occasional bones turned up by plow, but the significance remains. Guadalcanal was where the Japanese assumption that Americans were unfit for sustained, resolute combat died, where doctrine met reality and was forced to change, and where the Marines proved, through training, improvisation, and a stubborn refusal to yield, that the Western soldier could match, and in the operational context of industrialized total war eventually surpass, the fighting virtues Japan had long claimed to possess alone. If this story resonates, please like and subscribe to share more forgotten histories. Leave a comment on where you're watching from. Our community stretches across the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts, and together we remember the men who reshaped the course of the Pacific by holding a dirt airstrip and a ridge in a faraway jungle where everything changed.